Thank you to all of the presenters, and I hope you can all see that you've joined me now virtually anyway in a bit of a panel type plenary. Through the course of the talks this morning, we've had lots and lots of questions coming into the Slido. I'm working in the background with Jeff Morgan. We're trying to kind of sort and organize them. There are some questions that kind of cover what a number of people have asked, so we're sort of trying to sometimes pick one that's a bit more overarching. And we'll turn to those questions in just a minute. But I would firstly like to formally thank all of you for taking time out of your busy days and busy calendars and making time to join us here today. I am struck by the connection between all of the talks, and I'm also struck by some of the perspectives that I've heard from people who were not working in British Columbia but have stories or understandings that seem to apply very well to our situation here in British Columbia. So before we turn to the Slido questions, I'll just go around the panel and see if anybody would like to make a statement, offer a comment, provide a clarification, or anything that has come to mind to you over the course of the morning discussions. And I'll just go to you one at a time, and I'll go to you in the order that you appear on my screen here in the studio anyway. So Dr. Leela, I'll go to you first, and feel free to say no thanks if there's nothing in particular you want to add or offer, but I'll give everybody a chance if there is something. So I'll start with you, Dr. Leela. Eunice, are you on mute?
Yes, I was. Sorry about that.
There we go. No worries.
Thank you, Jason. I don't have any comment at this point, but I will add some feedbacks on some of the questions that came up later on.
All right, thank you. Tim, anything from you? You might be on mute too, Tim.
We're all on mute, huh?
Yeah, I'm muted. That's right.
Oh, there you go.
I could hear you guys, so it was all good. I read some of the questions, and I'll address them later. But first thing I'd say, in BC, our geology is glacial sediments. It's a ubiquitous cover, so I see different things in the States where they don't have quite as much the glacial sediments. We have a very young landscape as well, so it's still in flux. But I was interested in some of the stuff happening in California with the big mudslides and stuff like that. I think it was last fall. So there's different styles of failure, but we all have our different problems. So each individual area is quite different. So it's interesting to see other people's perspectives, but so many similarities in what I'm seeing from the other folks. And the one thing I did like hearing from Gordy and Becky was the positive effects of fire. I think the negative is that we get such extensive fire right now, and that's the problem we're having with these bigger floods and bigger fires, that they're just too big. We need to go back to small fires, so we need a more divided landscape, and that's what Becky was, I think, showing in some of her work. So that's interesting and good to see.
All right, thanks, Tim. Becky, I'll go to you next.
Sure, thank you so much for that. And yeah, Tim, I agree. There's a lot of parallels across our landscapes in what we see as outcomes for wildfire, and keeping that broader perspective that there are positive long-term effects for wildfire in some situations. I think something that can become quite problematic is the uncharacteristic wildfire, which you're talking about, these very large wildfires and more intense wildfires than may have been what we saw historically on the landscape. And that may be something that we can try to address through our management. But wildfires, it's not going away. It's never gone away. It's going to be our future. So how we learn to manage and live with wildfire, I think, is an important discussion point. And one of those mechanisms, Gordy talked about some of the adaptations of our native species to wildfire. And one of those big ones was movement. And I just can't emphasize enough how important maintaining connectivity in aquatic environments is for the recolonization and movement and migration of our species, this is one of their key adaptations to significant disturbance events that modify landscapes at broad spatial extents. So, post-fire and pre-fire, trying to understand and reduce barriers to movement is a really significant issue for aquatic systems. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Becky. Gordy, have you got any comments?
Yeah, people were talking. I was thinking it was interesting. So we have our terrestrial counterparts, and I don't know in BC or in other places, but here in the Northwest, there's a real emphasis on diverse early successional habitat, and that we feel is a missing component of the landscape. And the fires are one way of reestablishing these diverse early sural areas. And so it seems like we're poised to have a conflict. We're on the aquatic side, we're trying to avoid these effective fires because we perceive them as negative. And our terrestrial counterparts are looking at potentially restoring a successional state back on the landscape with the use of fires. And it turned out that if you're looking at terrestrial systems in terms of productivity and biodiversity, the early successional stages following fires tend to be some of the most diverse and productive of that whole cycle. And so we're going to have to sort of reconcile that with our terrestrial counterparts about we're trying to push these streams back real quickly to something that we think they should be in, while our terrestrial counterparts are looking at using the effective fire. So I think that's something that we haven't talked about here, but I think is really important. And I wanted to go back to something that Becky said, where she was talking about the landscape now, and I think it's probably true throughout the West, is, I know in Oregon, there's an estimate that we have 2 to 3 times more trees now than we had 100 years ago. And so you think about what did the landscape really look like? And we've been trying to do some modeling to say, what did the landscape look like with regard to the effect of fire? And by our best guess, we think, like in Western Oregon, as an example, about 60% of the watersheds were probably in what we would consider using our standard today, would be in good condition. That there was a mosaic of conditions similar to the terrestrial side of the ledger, where you had the conditions moving across the landscape, and that everything wasn't good and everything wasn't in perfect condition all the time. It was a mosaic of conditions, and we think about, I think we need to keep that in mind as we start to assess the effect of fire, that we can't just necessarily do it on one. We've got to look at the entire landscape and say, are we meeting, is that landscape healthy in terms of that mosaic of conditions, as opposed to a single spot?
All right, thanks, Gordy. Nicole, any thoughts or points from you?
I just would like to say, Becky and Gordy are spot on. I love their comments. I think it was Becky that said fires are natural and they're not going to go away. And she's so right. And I think the part that she said about connectivity and making sure that we have connectivity for these different fish populations, so if one drainage is impacted, you have that connectivity in other systems, so that when the system that was impacted is finally to a point where it can be fish habitat again, they can move back in. So I think what Becky and Gordy have said are so key in all of this.
Thanks, Nicole. And Jordan?
Nothing to add. We got a lot of really good comments and really good people here, so doing good work. So nice job, everybody.
Well, thank you for that round. I'd like to ask you something, and I'll invite anybody from the panel who wants to comment on this. Just put up your hand so that we don't get too much talking over each other. But I'm interested in just probing a little bit further the perspective that was kind of emerging around fires are natural. We need to accept that the ecosystem, as the Pacific Salmon Foundation focused, the fish have evolved to that natural circumstance. But the question I'd like to probe is, in light of the effects of human activity, both up till now and then the result of climate change, does that alter the kind of thinking around these things are natural, let them happen, and recognize that fish and other parts of the ecosystem are adapted to this? Do we need to think about considerate interventions if there are things that we're trying to manage for? And I would use the example of, say, a salmon population that's presently identified as being at conservation risk in a watershed where there has been a wildfire that is orders of magnitude larger than anything ever seen, at least in post-contact history. Does that change the thinking? Or do you still stick with the baseline of these are natural systems, fire is part of that natural system, and we shouldn't worry too much about trying to do things to mitigate effects? So that's just something that from my desk. And if you have a comment on that, put up your hand and I'll just go around the panel. Becky?
I think Gordy and I can probably both have some comments on that. One thing that I was careful to say in my presentation and in my other comments was characteristic wildfire. So I think there is a real difference between characteristic wildfire and some of the wildfires that we're seeing today that are the result of this intersection between how we are managing the landscape as well as climate change. So that's where trying to understand how we can use possibly controlled burns or other types of fires to allow us to modify the intensity of burns when we would expect them to be exceeding what we might expect for a specific area. But in some instances, allowing fires to burn may be the right answer to, particularly in places where you don't have as many concerns about infrastructure and other human habitations and things on the landscape, right? So from a fish perspective, that's also where my comment about connectivity comes in. And much of this is creating our landscapes so that when they do burn, because they will, that the post-fire effect will be something that would be potentially beneficial. So that's where making sure you don't have barrier culverts, making sure that you have connectivity in your systems to allow for resilience over the long term may be a helpful thing to do ahead of time. And certainly when you have highly fragmented landscapes, if you have populations of fishes that may be very vulnerable to wildfire and to extensive damage on the landscape, those are circumstances where you may want to reduce that fire intensity as much as you can and step in and do restoration and for those subpopulations. But that we saw that in some of the modeling work that we did on the Wenatchee system for bull trout populations that are isolated in headwater areas and may become more fragmented after a wildfire event, or whose population in some places may be fully extirpated if a significant fire and following debris flow occurs. So understanding the vulnerabilities of your fishes, and if you do have populations that are in need of extra assistance, then certainly trying to work proactively before the fire would be the ideal way, I would say, to respond to that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Becky. Gordy, go ahead.
I want to build on some of this thing that Becky just said, and I think one of the things I think we need to recognize, in many cases, we're not going to stop wildfire. It's going to be, the system, the landscape is set up to burn. The question in a situation that you just pointed out, Jason, I think is, can we maybe change the effect of fires? Can we go in and say pre-fire begin to reduce fuel loads? Can we begin to identify places that we don't want to see burn because we know that that'll have a major effect. For example, like I showed that one slide with the red areas outlined of riparian areas where if you lost them, water would warm. You could think about being proactive and going in and doing fuel reductions or putting fuel breaks in there to prevent the loss of those particular segments of the riparian veg. And so a lot of this could be done pre-fire and being strategic. I mean, I think one of the things we have to recognize is just not doing something, it's where we do it. And where we do it in the landscape is every bit as important as what we do. And so use these new tools and our understanding of how we look at that landscape to help us achieve, maybe you want to reduce the potential effect of fires in some places, and let's be strategic in how we go about doing it.
All right, thanks, Gordy. Any other thoughts on that one? I'll go to Eunice first, and then Nicole. I saw you, so I'll come to you after. Eunice, go ahead.
Thank you, Jason. The comment you made links to the question that was posed by one of the participants as to what are the linkages between Eunice's presentation and the theme of this workshop on the effect of wildfire on fish in the stream. And I do agree with your comment. There are not many pristine watersheds in BC that would have been impacted only by just wildfire. Most watersheds would have a history of past harvesting, roads, salvage operations, not to mention, of course, the climate change effects. And they're all at works over time and in space. And in my opinion, the only approach that accounts for the spatial and temporal nature of the disturbances and their hydrologic flood response is the FP-based approach that I'm trying to advocate and push forward. Again, I'm not aware of any study who have used the probabilistic framework to evaluate the effect of wildfire, either in isolation in a single watershed affected only by wildfire, or in larger watershed that could be affected by several disturbances in space, only one of which is actually wildfire, that have used the probabilistic approach. That approach is absent, particularly so, right, in the area of the relationship between wildfire and the flood regime. I mean, sure, ceteris paribus, the fish may or can recover from fire, but are we? I hope we are. Are we not interested in how the fish react to repeated threats from an increase in the frequency of the peak flows, either as a result of just the single disturbance being the wildfire, or a cumulative effect of several disturbances in space within the same watershed? Right? So typically what you see in over 100 years of literature in the forest hydrology on the effect of wildfire on the magnitude of the peak flows is basically CP-based. Is ceteris paribus, deterministic reductionist, one event at a time. Right? And I try to actually convey the message that that framework is non-causal. Hence, it leads to the incorrect measure of the effect of wildfire on the magnitude of the peak flows. Right? And of course, it does not invoke the dimension of frequency and how the disturbance is actually increasing the frequency of these events. Are we not interested in how the wildfire affect the frequency, at least for the sake of fish in the streams? I hope we are. Right? So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunice. Nicole?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, on the project that we talked about, I talked about how the stream was already degraded. And so we probably saw more impacts than maybe it would have had if we had a healthy system. So, going through making sure that you have priority areas set. If you have special or important fish populations that you really want to make sure are protected, make sure that riparian community is a healthy, productive one. And if it's not, then work towards getting it there. Because what I've seen in some of the other fire areas where I've worked is when we have a healthy riparian area, it seems to hold up better to these large flows than when it's a degraded system like the one we were working in. So just my 2 cents on it.
Thanks, Nicole. Tim or Jordan, did you want to jump in on this thread? No obligation. I just don't want to leave you out.
I was thinking about the scale of the problem in BC. We're such a big province, and then we're having these big fires. What Eunice is talking about is interesting, and the bigger watersheds react more. So I don't think we've been thinking on the scale of what's been occurring in the last 5 years in BC. But there's also the scale of the BC. It's just such a big. Where do we start? Do we protect the best first, or do we protect the downstream or the headwaters? We've got so many choices. Or do we always just pick the riparian zones and protect the best parts of some of the watersheds? So we've got such an immense problem. I guess we just have to start somewhere. Maybe this will provide some guidance, this workshop.
Thanks, Tim. Jordan, comment from you?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on what Tim is saying, I mean, there's such huge differences between what we do in Utah versus the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia. You guys have a lot of water. We have like 9 inches of rainfall a year. And so when we have a catastrophic wildfire, something that's uncharacteristic, it's pretty much wipes out our fish population. We have to go back in and restock it with fish from an adjacent drainage or something like that. I don't know if you have that same kind of issue with the fisheries in the Pacific Northwest. But what I would say, to kind of piggyback on what Tim was saying, is it's probably beneficial to identify your metapopulations of your salmon and probably protect those first. I'm going to guess that your landscape's a little bit more resilient to fire than ours, just because you have you have precipitation where we don't, and it may be easier to recover those satellite populations than your metapopulations.
Well, just a brief comment on that, Jordan. We are somewhat along the way to that in terms of some of our conservation management planning here. I don't think we've got it perfect. Salmon are probably ahead of many other species in BC because of the interest, investment, economy, and the cultural values around that. So it's a good point, and something that we're on our way to, but probably not fully there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of smart biologists up there. I'm sure you guys are right. You know what you're doing. So,
well, if we did, we probably wouldn't need to be sitting here today if we had it all figured out. So,
right.
Maybe I'll turn now to some of the Slido questions, and I'll start with the one at the top. And again, I'll invite anybody on the panel who would like to comment on this one just to put up their hand. So, are wildfires similar or different to harvesting with respect to hydrological impacts and peak flows? Well, Eunice, yeah, go ahead.
So, in my opinion, the effect of wildfire on the flood frequency curve, magnitude and frequency, is actually worst, although it's only temporarily and a shorter term effect. But viewed in that particular window, the effect of wildfire is way bigger the effect of conventional harvesting. And I think it's for rather obvious reasons, whereby the hydrophobic soil turns the watershed into, lots of overland runoff. If the flood event happened in the season immediately after the the wildfire, and that increases the variability of the peak flows around their mean, which then an increase in the variability steepen the post-wildfire disturbance dramatically and create a much bigger effect, although it's temporarily, than the conventional harvesting.
And Tim, do you want to add further comment to that? I know you were talking a bit about the effect on soils, or did Eunice cover everything?
No, I'd echo what he said in the that fire is worse than harvesting. For scale, for one thing, we get so much bigger fires. The harvesting is bad in many ways, but it's relatively confined compared to these immense fires. So the salvage harvesting on top of fire is a mixed bag, because sometimes it's good. It breaks up the hydrophobic soils, and we get that fragmentation of an ecosystem by replanting some areas and not others. So it starts to do the job that we ecologically we want to do. But fire across the riparian zones is terrible. It's much worse because we just don't generally harvest riparian zones, not greenwood or salvage harvesting. It's one of the recommendations that's provide guidance to keep out of riparian zones. So salvage harvesting is good because it breaks up the monotony of a burned area, but it's also bad because it increases the vulnerability for a short period of absolutely nothing on the ground. So I generally recommend a little bit of salvage harvesting, and in the bigger picture is probably a good thing, but it does increase your vulnerability for the short term over the long term vulnerabilities.
So Tim, I think you nicely covered that first question and went on to the next one. So we're touching into that. Gordy, I see you're indicating you have a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just like on the salvage logging. I think what we need to think about, and if we view fire as a disturbance, and I think that's what it is, and I view timber harvest as a disturbance as well. But if you think about it, what you want to think about it is sort of the frequency of the disturbance, and then the legacy of the disturbance. In other words, what's left over following that disturbance that system can use to move recover itself or move in a different direction. And I think one of the key things about salvage logging, we talk, well, we need to get those trees off the landscape. But what you've done then is potentially compromise a key legacy to the aquatic ecosystem, which is this large wood. And two things about that is, one is you've deprived the stream system itself of that component, that large wood. But two, oftentimes what we're worried about is erosion and particularly debris flow following both timber harvest and wildfires. And there's been some really interesting work done here in Oregon that shows that when you have large wood in your debris flows, the debris flows act very differently in terms of their behavior. They move down slope more slowly. They're not nearly as damaging. And once they hit the valley bottom, they tend to set up. And then once they're there, then the system's got large wood and sediment to work with. When we remove that, you get a very different type of landslide and a very different type of response. So I think we need to think about these things in terms of processes and how we alter those processes, both the occurrence of the processes and the legacies of those. Before we, use that mindset as we start talking about salvage logging. There may be some places, for example, you could do some salvage logging and not necessarily impact the system or have potential impact. In other places, you may have the system. So again, I'm coming back to this idea, it's not just what we do, it's where we do it.
Well, thanks for that, Gordy. Tim, I see you have your hand up. I'll just ask a follow-up question to see if this is a useful extension of that. Does it matter if we're talking about green tree harvesting or burnt tree salvage along the point that Gordy was raising? Or is it just a matter of you are changing the landscape cover, the forest cover, whether you're cutting a green tree or a tree in a salvage situation? But that's just a thought for me, Tim. If you were speaking to a different point, go ahead on what you want to cover.
Actually, I was going to address that because the recommendations after one of the big fires in BC, the Elephant Hill fire, there was a lot of interaction between First Nations and the provincial government. And one of the things that came out was directives for hydrologic recovery, geomorphology, all the other different aspects. And in the salvage harvesting portion, I recommended that you don't harvest over 30% unless you really are prepared to be careful and understand that you're working on steeper ground. You don't get cable harvesting when you salvage. It's just too expensive. So most times it's going to be skidder harvesting, which is a bit more intensive on the ground. It churns up the soils a bit more. So those, if you go on to steeper slopes, as Gordy was saying, you get onto the steep slopes, you get into lots of problems. So we generally say stay on the gentle slopes, less than 30% slope. That's about 15 degrees. And also harvest the black. Don't harvest the red, don't harvest the green. Not all the red dies, a lot of it does, but there's some that survive. And don't harvest the green because that's what we need. We need those big trees in the patchwork. So I think that answers the question that you were leading to.
Well, Tim, what I was wondering, and maybe you covered it, but I'll just check, is I'm wondering if the guidance for salvage is particularly different than the guidance for green tree harvest. Or like if we're looking at, the idea of this playbook, okay, there's been a fire, what do you do? And if you just go with what you would do anyway, from a harvest perspective, then you say, okay. But if from a perspective of what is going to be either good for salmon or least bad for salmon, would you do something different than the conventional?
I think the companies, the logging companies, just find it too expensive to do cable logging, which is a bit cleaner on the steep slopes. They only do cable harvesting on the steep slopes, so you wouldn't see it on the gentle slopes. So I think that it changes how the logging companies are looking at the salvaging opportunity, and they generally go for the gentler slopes, and they do prefer to go into green or mixed green with black and red. It just happens. But we try to push them towards the black. I think that's what we're shooting for. And gentle slopes and avoiding riparian, avoiding snow zones, the upper headwaters of watersheds so we don't get the snowpack issues on top. And then poor planting sites, rocky sites, all those different things. That the guidance is there. We understand it. But trying to get that on a block by block scale is very difficult, I guess.
Okay, thanks for that, Tim. I'd like to cover as many of the questions as we can, at least touch on them anyway. And we've got many more sitting in the Slido queue, but I'll turn to the next one we've got up in our screen here. Gordy's perspective on fish recovery post-fire and post-disturbance is very positive. Are there planning considerations here? That is, are there management or restoration activities that should or should not be done post-fire? So Gordy, since this references a comment from you, I'll maybe give you first crack at this if you care to.
Yeah, thank you. This is interesting because this is the first time I've seen anybody think this is positive. Most people think this is crazy. But in terms of planning, yes, I think there are a couple things. One that I just touched on is this idea of legacy, and the legacy of the, thinking about it in terms of ecological processes and the legacies from the fire, and making sure we retain those, because that's going to determine how the system's going to respond moving forward. If it's got the components that we know are needed for restoration or for recovery in it, it can move forward. What we should be doing then is identifying where those processes occur on the landscape, and either during a fire post-fire, use that information to help guide what we can do and how we're going to do it. And I think I want to go back to Becky's, I touched on this a couple times about connectivity. We need to be thinking about the landscape now in terms of connectivity. We can't wait post-fire to do that. This should be a priority in terms of culverts, other types of blockages that impede movement within and amongst watershed, because how the fish respond is going to depend entirely upon their ability to move across that landscape. And that's something we need to prioritize and work on right now. That's not so that's not something we want to think post-fire. At post-fire, it may be too late because it may be too long before a new cohort of fish can get in there. So I think we need to start. That's something we can do now to begin to address this issue.
Okay, thanks, Gordy. Any other comments on this thread from the panel? All right, I'm not going to wait too long in a silence just because we got lots of questions in the queue here. Or sorry, Tim, were you trying to say something on that one? I don't mean to cut you off. No? Okay. I'll go to the next one in the queue, and I think this one, if I'm seeing it properly, is it's from Pete Nicklin. Hi, Pete. I work on salmon and steelhead in the Chilcotin Watershed, interior BC. We've had recent large wildfires, salvage logging, pine beetle impacts. What framework can help guide proper, in quotes, restoration and silviculture to prevent repeating mistakes? So that is a broad scale overarching question, but I think it really is at the nub of what we are trying to get to with regard to some of the thinking in our playbook project. But I'll put that to the panel to see if anybody has comment or experience or perhaps examples or references of somebody else that is already doing something like this, and we can ride their coattails. Gordy, go ahead.
I mean, again, I think doing the right thing in the right place is really key here, because we can't do everything everywhere. In terms, I was looking at the silviculture question, for example. And I'll come back to that example with the riparian areas. Knowing on the landscape where those places are and prioritizing those as places where we want to make sure we got big trees in the right places. And so again, coming back to this point, and I think we may be in the early portions of our understanding, but we're gaining a better understanding about this. How to look at this landscape. It's not just uniform. That different things go on in different places, and bringing that knowledge to bear as we try to develop these restoration, recovery, whatever we want to call them, programs, is being strategic in what we do and where we do it. And there are tools available that we can do that to guide the activities and to help ensure that we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck.
So Gordy, just to follow up for that, are there tools in particular that you're aware of or that you would point us to here in British Columbia that might have been used successfully in your experience elsewhere?
Well, we've been working on a platform called NetMap, which is some folks in Northern California. We've been working with them for years on this, and we've got a whole series of analysis tools. There's some for fire, there's timber harvest, those type of things. But again, what it is, it's really a landscape analysis tool. It's something that is very very analogous to how terrestrial people think about their landscape. When we've been trying to do something that's analogous from an aquatic perspective. So that's one example I could point you to. And I'm sure there are others. Other people, other people have different ways of doing this. But again, I think we need to recognize that we need to be strategic. And in order to be effective, we've got to have a strategy for doing that. And we should be, I think there are options for doing that now that we can use. They may not be the best. They're certainly going to be improved upon in the future. But we should take advantage of those things right now.
All right, thanks, Gordy. Becky.
I just had a quick comment on this. It may seem really obvious, but I'll say it anyway. And that's that as we're trying to understand and prioritize aquatic habitats and processes that are occurring in aquatic systems, particularly as they relate to disturbance effects like wildfire, we need to have aquatic folks and terrestrial folks at the table at the same time in order to develop the framework that they're going to work within to be able to understand at a broader spatial extent the interaction between our landscapes and our aquatic systems. So that melding of disciplines and getting a lot of people with different sorts of expertise at the table is really helpful. We have a tendency to compartmentalize our forestry from our fisheries. And if we can bring those together, that's going to help develop a framework where both of them are informed by the priorities, work, and understanding of the other. So that would be something I would respond to in terms of framework. Just make sure that you're integrating, that you've got expertise representing different perspectives, because our terrestrial people seem to tend to think about the landscapes a bit differently than our aquatic people do. So that bigger perspective and integrated perspective may be helpful in trying to understand how to move forward with the slew of disturbance processes that were listed in that question, but that are really common across our landscapes.
All right. Well, thanks, Becky and Gordy, for that. I know others on the panel may have thoughts on this one, but to try to cover as much ground as we can, I'm going to go to the next question in our Slido. This one's from Wayne S. I'm guessing that's my friend Wayne Selesky up in Vanderhoof. Hi, Wayne, if that's you. We need to examine harvesting practices in relationships to the existing riparian health at the time of the wildfires. We are creating wicks that are carrying fire from slash block to slash block, especially where mountain pine beetle salvage was taking place. So that's I think, an interesting perspective specific to parts of British Columbia where we've, because of past practice, we've got very, very probably unnaturally large stands of relative monoculture, mono-age, lodgepole pine in plateaus. And we have an unnatural condition, I would call it. And then the current management seems to be, at least to Wayne's point, compounding that. So I'd be interested to know if people from the panel have comments on this point from Wayne. Or advice. Gordy, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, these are really interesting because they're hitting home on a bunch of issues we're facing here in Western Oregon. But on this one, I mean, I think the key part that stuck out to me was the management of riparian areas. And one of the things we face here is there's a reluctance to manage riparian areas because we fear that, we fear that that's going to have a negative effect on aquatic habitat. I think we need to think about what does it mean to manage these aquatic, riparian areas, and to challenge ourselves to think about how we do that. And I think in doing that, one of the things we need to think about is being able to manage from the edge of the stream out to the edge of the riparian zone, not just in some outer boundary. Because I agree, in many cases, we may be, we've got very heavy stocking going on in many of our riparian areas beyond what would ever occur because we haven't had a fire through there in a long time, or we've intentionally planted them to conifers at the expense of the deciduous species. And so, we need to, I think that it's time for some really significant conversations about what riparian management means and looking for other options other than no management. And the idea that, no management is not no effect, I think that whole concept should be challenged.
Thanks, Gordy. We're closing in on our lunch break and the end of this panel discussion. I'll go to the next question and see if we can do this one some justice. There seems to be a lot of interest in beavers for restoration. For example, the use of BDAs, beaver dam analogs, I'm assuming that means. Perhaps they help create fire-resistant riparian areas and also create fish habitat. Please provide perspective. So Jordan and Nicole, I think you were covering BDAs in some of your talk. Do you want to offer a comment or advice on this one?
Go for it, Jordan.
Sure. Our partner from the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program with Fish and Wildlife Service termed it best in one of his interviews in one of our videos. He said that he talked about how BDAs spread the water out across the landscape and create a green ribbon. You know, we live in a desert state, and so those green ribbons are really pronounced. And at least here in Utah, they definitely help with some fire resilience. As far as habitat goes, it kind of depends on where we're putting them. When we have a fire come across one of our streams, usually we have degradation of the stream bed and it down cuts. And so we're trying to grade the stream bed back up to the floodplain. In that case, it doesn't really create a lot of fish habitat. We saw that evidenced in some of these habitat studies that one of our partners did. But if we're putting them in as a kind of a precursor to fire, as work to prevent too much damage if fire comes through, then it certainly does. It creates deep pool cover that our fish tend to like a lot. So.
All right, thanks, Jordan. Nicole, did you want to offer a brief comment further to that, or did that cover everything?
No, Jordan nailed that spot on.
All right, thanks.